In the early 1960s, two Slovak-born historians based in Israel, Yeshayahu Jelinek and Akiva Nir, conducted dozens of interviews of Holocaust survivors who during World War II were active in the Slovak resistance. Over the years, those interviews given in Hebrew have rarely been used in historical research. Jelinek was one of the first scholars who made use of oral history long before it became widespread in Holocaust studies. These valuable interviews contain life stories of ordinary Jews, presenting their personal narratives less than 20 years after the war. They depict the different perspectives of those mostly unknown fighters, ordinary anonymous players based on their own reminiscence and different points of view. Most interviewees were neither commanders nor leaders, but rather regular individuals whose lives had been completely changed in that time of upheavals. Unlike top-down historical accounts based on official documentation, these bottom-up interviews are entirely subjective. They can be found in the Moreshet Holocaust Archive and in the Institute of Contemporary History at the Hebrew University. I have used in my research about 40 interviews. Though 20 years have passed, it was the first time for most of them to open up and tell their stories out loud. Like many other Holocaust survivors, they sought to build new life for themselves and their families, to repress the harsh memories and put them behind. The atmosphere in the newly born state of Israel in its first 2 decades, just getting out of a prolonged war of independence, did not always encourage survivors to speak about their past. Adolf Eichmann's trial, held in 1961, changed the way the Holocaust and its survivors were perceived, and perhaps served as one of the catalysts for this interviewee's willing to talk. This was their opportunity to openly speak about their murdered families, their lost youth, and the old homeland they had fought for, which was not always kind to them. Part of the survivors had been teenagers during the war. Others already had children and professions, doctors and merchants, university graduates, and simple tradesmen, among others. They were born and grew up in cities and small towns across Slovakia to religious Orthodox families or to secular and integrated ones. But what they had in common was their participation in the Slovak resistance, their survival, and immigration to Israel after the war. Let me share with you some historical background. In 1939, an independent Slovak state was established under the leadership of Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest, collaborating closely with Nazi Germany. Between March and October 1942, about 58,000 Slovak Jews were deported to the extermination camps in Poland, Auschwitz, Majdanek, and others. About 22,000 Jews remained in Slovakia. Approximately 4,000 Jews were imprisoned at the 3 labor camps established in 1942 in Slovakia. Most of them managed to survive thanks to their hard work producing items that were vital for the economy of the country during the war. Living conditions were described by most of the camp inmates as relatively reasonable. The children got education, and sport and cultural activities were organized. Underground groups formed in the camps started to prepare for resistance and rescue attempts when the time comes. In 1942, partisan units started to operate in Slovakia. At the end of August 1944, a national uprising erupted and about 2,500 Jews took part in it. After the uprising, about 13,000 remaining Jews were again deported to camps. Moshe Burian, who was an underground activist in Sered camp, remembered the day he received a weapon and hid it from his mother, who shared lodging with him. He recalls in his testimony the positive feelings as Jews prepared for resistance. I quote, "With all the trouble we had, it was a happy time. It was relatively free, and we were happy that we were getting organized to resist and defend ourselves. A few people who came over from Poland to our camp incited us and added to the spirit of rebellion by telling what was happening in the extermination camps there." Nachum Spiegler, who was part of the Novaky camp's Jewish police, added, "We heard about the partisans on the Slovakian-Polish border in the beginning of 1944 and about the Russian paratroopers who arrived and organized underground actions against the German army. By the summer, we had already heard that there was a group of armed partisans at the village of Novaky. At that time, we started getting organized for the days to come. We had no illusions." The Jewish boys at the Novaky camp had a role in the underground without being aware of it. Shmuel Ramati Neumann was about 13 years old when he was imprisoned with his family. His older brother was a member of the underground, and since they lived together, he occasionally saw parts of weapons hidden in a stash under his brother's bed. In his interview, he told about the children's role. "As youngsters, wandering in and out of the camp, we were sometimes sent on errands for the underground organization. We did not know what they were planning, but could tell that something was going on. They would send us to take messages to people outside the camp. We always went in groups and played in a certain place where vast meadows stretched between the trees. While playing, someone would approach us and ask if there was something for him, and we would give him the note without knowing its content. As far as I know, none of us dared open those notes. Only on the night of August 28, the night before the outburst of the Slovak national uprising, did we realize the missions we had carried out were part of the underground activity." Katya Karmi heard that an uprising broke out in the center of Slovakia and that the flag of the Free Republic was raised in Banska Bystrica, which became the center of the rebels. She joined a small group of Jews who wandered through the mountains until they reached an area under rebel control, who suggested that they board a train to Banska Bystrica. When they arrived, they saw, I quote, "a city adorned with flags and a sense of imminent uprising with all its frenzy. Pamphlets called on the non-combative population to dig anti-tank trenches and called on all men to join the army. Various groups of combatants, French and Russian, were walking the streets of the bustling city, and above all the Jews, with a winning expression on their faces, standing in groups and discussing the new situation. It had been years since the Slovakian Jews had tasted freedom, hence the joy that surrounded them." The journey of the Jews who escaped Novaky camp towards Banska Bystrica was not an easy one. They all remember leaving the camp and how they sang aloud all the way. The joy was great for being liberated, and we all had weapons and were ready to fight the Germans, testified Zeev Landau. Tzvi Levkovich also remembered the initial sensation. We, the Jews, were excited at the end of August 1944 because it was the first chance we got to avenge the Germans for what they had done to us. However, some testimonies indicate that the uprising was, to a certain degree, a disappointment to those who saw it up close. And here lies one of the importance of the testimonies, as we learn how those Jews saw the events and felt towards them. Spiegler said in his testimony, "There was no organization, no contact or coordination between the units. No one knew what the others were doing or where they were going. There were Germans with cannons and tanks, and all we had were rifles, without any intelligence, no information about what was going on. We went into battle out of idealism, but also out of lack of choice. We had no option, as the non-Jews had, to strip off our uniforms and go back home. We did not have a home to go back to. We only had one option, to fight. Either you succeed and make it out alive or not. We were passive for 5 years, and then we were given the chance to face the Germans as equals, in arms." Yochanan Blaufeder also testified on those first days of liberation and fighting. "We were free on the first day. After we left, we got an order to fight. We did not know how to do it. Nothing was organized. There were hundreds of people there, much noise and aimless shooting. We saw no commanders, had no food, and were tired. 2 months later, when the uprising failed, circumstances changed again. The Jews who had no homes nor families to go back to and were again under threat of deportation had to look for new ways of survival. Many escaped to the mountains, hoping to find refuge and join the partisans." Examining the testimonies regarding the period following the collapse of the uprising, 2 main points surfaces: the chaotic conditions and the harsh weather. Interviewees tell that there was no organization whatsoever. People did not know where to go, what to do, and whom to approach. They joined partisans units in random. Additionally, it was very cold, rainy, and snowy, and they stood defenseless against the power of nature. People froze to death. Others lost toes and legs. There was a shortage of food, clothing, and equipment, and it was hard to find shelters. Dr. Klein, in a dramatic testimony, recalled his time with the partisan unit, to which he was accepted due to being a medical doctor. I quote, "We walked around aimlessly, having no contact with the outside world. Food was running out fast, and we had nowhere to sleep. It was already -15, -20 degrees, and there was no option for a roof over our heads at night. After a while, we met Russian groups, and they got us organized, gave us missions such as blowing up bridges and trains." He continues talking about the atmosphere amongst the partisans. "Since I was the only medic in the unit, they made sure nothing bad happened to me. But they were sometimes mad at me too. For instance, when they got a hold of some alcohol and got drunk, they wanted me to give them all sorts of treatments. Everyone suffered both from the cold and were freezing. I obviously did not have the proper medication, and they would always blame me and ask how come I was a doctor and did not have any medications." Dr. Klein tells that there was also some romance. He himself got involved with a female farmer from the area who was a liaison woman to the partisans. She would do whatever I asked. I wanted to know where my parents disappeared to and asked her to try and look for them. The unit would move from one place to another, and Dr. Klein told his girlfriend to where they were going. When she showed up at the new location, she was immediately caught and interrogated on how she had found out about their move. She admitted that Klein had told her. Those Slovakian anti-Semites obviously wanted to kill me immediately, claiming it was treason, he recalled. But then the Russians stepped up and said, "Don't do it. We do not have another doctor." Many more stories about the hardships and confusion were told by most interviewees. Landau remembered the first days after the failed uprising. We left Banska Bystrica and started going towards the mountains and met Russian partisans who refused to take unarmed people. There was big chaos, no organization whatsoever. It was raining and cold. Slovaks who came down from the mountains dropped their weapons and dispersed into the villages. Someone who was with me got depressed and asked to be shot. One of the testimonies, which I found fascinating, is that of Steffi Friedman Neumann, who went with a group to the mountains to join partisans, but they were attacked by Germans. They hid in a ditch, and when they came out, they saw the dead bodies of their friends and 2 wounded. One of them was Hilly, a 17-year-old who begged them to take him along, but it was not an option. They left food for Hilly, put his guts back into his stomach, and promised to be back for him. They met a lodger on the way and told him there was an injured boy down the road. Several days later, she heard in the village that they had taken him to a hospital in Banska Bystrica by Sly. From Akiva Nir's book, written 20 years later, we learn that Hilly is Dr. Hillel Cohen, who miraculously survived. The Germans found him and his injured friend on the ground. They shot the friend who was severely injured, while Hilly pretended to be dead. His leg was amputated at the hospital, but he recovered and moved to Switzerland after the war. And you can see in this photo Hilly and Shmuel Ramati. One lost a leg and the other lost both his legs. At the end of each interview, Jelinek would ask the witnesses to reflect back and try to assess their experiences during the war. The opinions expressed by them are varied and sometimes contradictory, each based on their own personal memories and emotions. To sum up, today I presented a small part of a large under-researched collection of testimonies. These testimonies of dozens of former Slovak Jews who participated in the Slovak national uprising and later joined the partisans recounted their personal memories of that time and provided details and observations from bottom-up perspectives. Their personal stories expose less known, often inconsistent picture of Jews who had survived deportation and persecution and wished to fight and contribute to their country's resistance. They took this rare opportunity to go back to those traumatic days, not only to tell, but also to assess their experience and reflect on it. Those under-researched testimonies provide additional insights into the role of Jews in the Slovak resistance during World War II. I want to conclude with a quote of Martin First's testimony. The interviewer asked him how this period affected him. He answered, "It has affected me, especially my nerves. Seeing young men walking and singing Tikva, the Jewish national anthem, before they died. They had hope. Who would have thought that healthy and beautiful people are taken just because their crime was that they were born Jews? And I saw it. I saw how people died. I remember hunger and bombings, humiliated people who had lost all human spirit. I saw what they, the Germans, had made of people. Thank you very much.